You know, China calling this ruling unjust, unlawful. Why are they taking this stance, especially as signatories of this treaty of the UNCLOS, which established this court of arbitration? And also, we know that this treaty largely rejects historically based claims like China.
Thank you very much for having me. July the 12th will be a day of infamy in history. From the very beginning of this arbitration brought by the government led by the former President Aquino III of the Philippines, China has made its position very clear. That is, China is not a party to this arbitration. China will not recognize the ruling, whatever form or shape it will take. And yesterday's ruling is an attempt to deprive the Chinese people of ancient, old territories and sovereignty rights in the South China Sea, which has been recognized by most of the country throughout the former decades. And partially, this legacy is based on the victory legacy of the Second World War. Therefore, I think the Chinese government has decided to treat this ruling out of The Hague as a piece of scrap paper. The Chinese people are uniting behind the Chinese leadership to defend sovereignty and territorial integrity in the South China Sea. Meantime, China is ready to talk and negotiate with countries like the Philippines to achieve a peaceful resolution of the territorial disputes involved in the South China Sea.
A couple of things. I guess you know, a lot of scholars will say that China's historical claims aren't really that historic, and you say that sort of post-war they go back. I think it was 1947 when the what was then the 11-dash line was drawn out. But perhaps more importantly and more relevant, you know, the UN's Law of the Sea agreement, it rejects the idea of justification about historical right. It says that it doesn't apply when you signed the document, and China signed the document. They worked on the document. So how can they turn around now and say, well, we're not going to abide by it?
First of all, historically speaking, there have been many countries who eventually decided to completely ignore the ruling from a tribunal like this out of The Hague. The United States did that. Many other countries did that. China is not the first country to decide to disregard the ruling, and China will not be the last country to do that. That's number one. Number two is that this ruling itself is actually in violation of the terms of the UNCLOS itself, and China is a major member state of the UNCLOS, and China has been faithfully abiding by the UNCLOS, and China considers this tribunal itself as illegal because it's outstepping its mandate and it's disregarding the specific terms stipulated in the UNCLOS itself. The United States itself is not a member state of UNCLOS. China by now is the largest member state of the UNCLOS, and there are many scholars both in China and abroad who are now advising the Chinese government to consider withdrawing from UNCLOS. Therefore, this tribunal's decision is actually ending in weakening the authority and the functionability of the UNCLOS itself. I hope the Chinese government will not decide to leave UNCLOS, but China needs to do whatever it is necessary as a sovereign right to defend its territorial rights in the South China Sea, regardless of this ruling coming out of The Hague on July the 12th.
So, you know, China says that this is, you know, their territorial right to do what it's doing and has been doing in the South China Sea. But we're also hearing that China is willing to negotiate with some of these other countries, you know, with the same competing claims. But what is there to negotiate, you know, if China is going to continue to say that, you know, 80 to 90% of the South China Sea is ours? What is open for negotiation?
You are absolutely right. As a matter of fact, history has proven that the best and the most effective way to resolve territorial disputes is through negotiation and diplomacy and peaceful discussions between the claimants. And this is not an exception for China and the Philippines. From the very beginning, the Chinese government had insisted that the best way to resolve the disputes between China and the Philippines is to sit down at the negotiation table, use all our wisdom and vision and courage to come up with a mutually acceptable way between China and the Philippines. We are very happy to see that the new government in Manila and new president, Mr. Duterte, effort are reaching out to the Chinese side. Both China and the Philippines want to have peace and good neighborly relations with each other.
But Victor,
we treasure the moment of peace.
Forgive me,
and the Chinese
that wasn't
people
the
view the Filipino people as friends.
That doesn't deal with the point that Amra was making. If China's saying 90% of the South China Sea is ours, we don't accept this ruling by an organisation that we signed on to, and we don't accept it, then what's to negotiate?
I think that's exactly the purpose of sitting down at the negotiation table, to deal with each other with full respect as good neighbors, good friends, and talk about whatever that can be achieved. I think former paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping, said the right thing. That is, whenever we have such disputes, we can put them aside for the moment. We can focus on common development. And I think between China and the Philippines, it still remains the truth. That is, we need to focus on common development, and China and the Philippines need to be friends and good neighbors rather than, escalating tension. China has no intention of escalating tension against the Philippines. And as I mentioned just now, the Chinese people, the Filipino people should remain friends and good neighbors.